Hey everyone, and welcome to All Tech is Human. If you're unfamiliar with what All Tech is Human, welcome. We try to onboard people into the responsible tech space. And speaking of responsible tech, that's why today's conversation is all about big tech, power, and diplomacy. And for this conversation, we'd like to thank our partner, TheBridge. Check them out at thebridgework.com. They're all about breaking down silos between technology, policy, and politics. Really excited about the guest that we have for today. We have Alexis and Rana, who I'm going to be introducing, and then we're going to learn a little bit more. But I'm sure you'll be fascinated with their extensive backgrounds into this issue. First, we have with Alexis Wichowski. She is the Deputy Chief Technology Officer for Innovation for the City of New York, and also the author of a very timely book, which has the title, The Information Trade, How Big Tech Conquers Countries, Challenges Our Rights, and Transforms Our World. So Alexis, welcome. Oh, there we go. And we got the book plug.
Thank you
Rana.
so much.
I like that. So I'll also introduce Rana Sarkar. He is the Consul General of Canada in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and also we should throw in Hawaii as well. So Rana, welcome to our All Tech is Human live stream.
Great to be here.
So this topic couldn't become any more hot and contentious, maybe, and topical. Alexis, I'll start off with you. Love to learn a little bit more about your role right now with the City of New York, and also with the book, The Information Trade, and then how it dovetails with this issue. Because really, what we're talking about is how, in many ways, big tech companies are kind of acting like countries. They have an immense amount of power and capital, and oftentimes borderless, and this seems to be leading to a lot of friction. So Alexis, do tell us a little bit more about what you're working on and how it dovetails with this topic.
Absolutely. So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm working with the City of New York as the Deputy CTO in Innovation. One of the big projects that our office has been working on since the pandemic hit is actually just closing the digital divide. We're trying to make sure there's enough infrastructure in place so that we can get the last million New Yorkers who are not connected at home online for work, for school, for everything that they need to do. And this is one of the things that I think was really relevant with when I was researching the book, talk about this idea of the big tech companies acting like governments in a lot of ways, acting like nation states. And the fact that they have accumulated so much power and capital and have a user base that are in some ways they treat like their citizens. They offer them certain rights and privileges, or there's other kinds of rules and principles in place that are different than national regulations about citizens. One of the things, though, that I thought was really interesting about these particular group of tech companies, which I call net states, because they're really different than traditional tech companies in a lot of ways, is that they're also getting interested in things like infrastructure, like closing the digital divide, laying submarine cable down in the ocean. Facebook, during the height of the COVID pandemic in New York City, spent something like $6 billion to buy a cable to connect about 28 countries in Africa. So we're seeing these tech companies moving outside of their core digital services and products and into areas that used to be really government stuff. Things like electricity and power grids and telecommunications were not something that you think of like Instagram thinking about, but the people who own Instagram, Facebook are doing just that.
Yeah, and even when we think about the founding of development of the internet, well, we know Al Gore's involvement, right? But we also know that the U.S. government and also through the military, spent a considerable amount of money to kind of extend the development of the internet. Whereas now, as you're talking about, it seems like a lot of the research and development is being done more on the commercial side. So Rana, I want to bring you in to this conversation. Tell us a little bit more about your role representing Canada, because that certainly seems like a unique one. Some people might be familiar with the role that got a lot of media attention last year with Denmark, with their techplomacy, their ambassador that was also in Silicon Valley. So love to hear a little bit more about your role, some of the opportunities and challenges that you're seeing.
Sure. Thanks so much. And you mentioned Kasper Klinge, who's the Danish, who's since left the job very recently, but was the Danish tech ambassador and based here in Silicon Valley, and that of course catalyzed, I think, a lot of the conversation about what forms of representation are appropriate for tech, just as Alexis was speaking, just as in the context of these large tech platforms that have completely dwarfed many aspects of the traditional economy, and it's happening in the context of a real, not just geopolitical shift and geoeconomic shift towards a very different type of economy that where information is not just an aspect of the economy, but is actually the main sort of trading variable in what's taking place right now. And so there's so all of this is going on in the context of an enormous geoeconomic shift right now to this intangible economy. And so I think states, Canada included, I think that I was appointed here by the Prime Minister to be based here in Silicon Valley to do a variety of things. And the question is that are you a ambassador to a bunch of tech companies, which typically don't get an ambassador level appointment, or even a specific appointment towards them, or rather are you somebody who is embodying a set of characteristics and building a sort of a team that is able to sense make, to develop a whole set of diplomatic relations, not just with the companies themselves, but the ecosystem more broadly, the venture community, a lot of the NGOs that are doing extraordinary work right now with the universities and the think tank culture that is evolving around these issues. Because what we're really doing right now is that we're all developing a kind of co-literacy in terms of what is actually taking place. Because part of the problem, as Alexis was speaking about, was, and her book very nicely goes into, is that part of it is the mismatch between the mechanisms that we currently have in place that are about states, or it's about dealing with companies and internal company things that come from an industrial economy metaphor to this new structure. And so all of us are adjusting our sets, and we're developing these new literacies. We're developing a whole new set of institutions. We're developing partnerships and cooperation across borders while this is taking place. And so for me, the job, is building this kind of sense-making apparatus, because a lot of the conversations that we're having is also internally within government. So it's not just with the states, other companies or other states. It's building this cross-literacy within our government, because any one of these large platforms are going to be connected to our government and many other governments in about 9, 10, 12 different places, all of which have expertise to deal with them. But we're not particularly well coordinated internally to talk to them, nor do we really have the appropriate metaphor for what these things are, because that's all evolving very fast. And so I think that this is, there's been, I can go into it a little bit further, but there's at least been 2 or 3 different phases since I've been here in 2017, of evolution that we've seen.
Well, Alexis, this is where I'd love to bring you in, especially for your role with the City of New York. What are you noticing on your end to build on Rana's point about this kind of cross-sector experience or need, really, with maybe a greater bridge between the tech sector and people who are operating inside of government? What are you seeing on your end, or what do you think needs to be done?
Well, I think that Canada has got it right. I think that the fact that Rana's got this position is exactly what we need to be seeing more of. It would be wonderful to see this happening in every country, because there's, as Rana had mentioned, there's just a new kind of relationship that we're building with the tech ecosystem that we don't really have good, as you mentioned, literacy for or language for. This is one of the reasons why I introduced this new term, net states, in my book. And it goes back to actually looking at the way that tech platforms were fighting terrorism. back in 2015, 2016, when ISIS was really at its peak. We knew what nation states were, the countries, and we knew that the non-state actors like ISIS were like the bad guys, but the role of tech companies whose platforms were being used to organize and recruit, we didn't really have a good way to talk about them in this kind of dynamic.
Yeah.
So that's why I thought it was time to acknowledge their difference and their distinction from traditional companies with a new term like net states. Like, for instance, Facebook's counterterrorism team is larger than the counterterrorism team at the State Department.
Wow.
And it's not even that strange to think about Facebook having a counterterrorism team, knowing what we know about how the platform has been used. But if you think about other companies like Walmart or McDonald's having a counterterrorism team, it would seem kind of absurd.
Yeah.
So I think that Rana said it really wonderfully when you talked about needing a new kind of literacy to talk within government and between governments and the tech sector about the kind of dynamic that we need to strike.
Well, this is where I'm curious, since you bring up Facebook, obviously a lot of issues that we can dig in there with how they are extended across the globe, right? Now with all their different Facebook family properties like WhatsApp and Instagram now approaching 3 billion people, extensive amount of individuals. When you think about Facebook, we tend to know its origin story, right? Being founded in a Harvard dorm room, very, very American company. However, now it's touching all different corners of the world. Do we think that Facebook and other companies similar to that should be primarily where they derive from, or does it need to be kind of a amalgam? Does it need to kind of morph with all the different countries it's in? So, for example, Facebook is currently having a kind of a diplomatic issue with Turkey. That is creating or just created a new law basically saying that they would like to have a Turkish office for Facebook there, and that all the data needs to maintain itself in Turkey, and that it basically stamped the kind of social mores and historical kind of aspects of Turkey more so on Facebook. So how do we deal with an issue like that? Because that seems to be a struggle right now for social media platforms, is that most of them are based in America. So do you wonder, does that kind of imprint of how we balance free expression versus privacy, is that something that now is getting kind of extended throughout the world? Or is it their role to adjust, to say, okay, here's how Canada is different than America. Here's how Turkey is different than America. So Rana, what do you think about something like that?
I think that, to an extent, this has to do with the history of and the fast rise of the organizations themselves, where they only really started to understand and maybe laterally start to take responsibility for some of their actions or the externalities of the platform. Very late in the game, as they were already multi-billion user platforms at that stage, and when we started to realize that the negative externalities were just so profound. And what I think that where it sort of is more similar to many other the usual politics of multilateral organizations is that, or multinational organizations, is that for the longest period, in the post-war period, we've gone through a period where playing geographic arbitrage for multinational corporations was, essentially a part of, this globalization 2.0 that we were in. I think that, the context where the Facebooks will be having to be much more nuanced and to use the diplomatic and the political leverage that they're adopting is that, we are probably entering a world where we're starting to see the resurgence of sovereignty, and nation states are starting to, relook at the sovereignty arrangements that have been in place and recognize that there are challenges in having players that are acting in their jurisdiction where they have no control over. And I think that the large platforms are going to start to inevitably start to pick some sides. And and that is, my projection. I mean, it's not, our government's projection necessarily, but it's one that I see as, something that we're seeing in the next 3 or 4 years. And so what does that mean in terms of picking sides? It means that, look, the First Amendment principles that, where we're having this kind of, extended sort of conversation about in the United States around these platforms do not necessarily translate well. We have very different formats of rights protection, even within Canada, which is a very like neighbor, but certainly within the European Union. But also, if you extend it further into places like India and countries within Africa, for instance, and others, they have very different sets of tolerance levels. And so I think that each of these companies are going to have to deal with it on a country by country basis, but they also have to recognize, and we'll start to see, is that the nation state in which they're housed, they owe a lot more allegiance to that than they would probably otherwise want to admit.
So, Alexis, what would you imagine are the types of roles that these tech companies should be hiring for then, if they're going to be thinking about these diplomatic issues? Specifically, what Rana's talking about of maybe more sovereignty with some of these nations. It seems like a lot of European countries right now are pushing back at a lot of the big tech companies, especially around their data use. I know there's been a few issues in Ireland and other places around how the information is stored there. So, what would you say from the tech perspective? What would you say is needed with some of these roles?
Well, yeah, I think that in the beginning, a lot of these companies, they were just trying to get off the mat and into the game. They had people who could code and design, and they worried about, we'll figure out the ethics stuff later. I think what we're seeing now is a realization that not only do the big players need to have robust policy teams, and not just people who understand things like how to interpret legislation, but actual diplomats and the recruiting people from the diplomatic community, as we saw Microsoft do with Casper Kling, who brought him on board to be their ambassador to the EU. That I think we're going to see a lot more of that kind of thing happening, where they're in the burning need a few years ago was to address terrorism on their platform. So they created counterterrorism teams. And I think the next phase that we're going to see is creating diplomatic corps within their teams. Because in the same, as you described with the Turkey example, it's just like countries have different kinds of relationships with different other countries. I think the tech companies are going to strike different kinds of balances and different kinds of arrangements with different countries in which they're operating and doing business. So they'll have different treaties, and those treaties will need to be negotiated and managed.
Interesting. Yeah. And this is where I'd also like to mention for everybody tuning in, one, thank you for being here. But two, this is where I'd love for you to just start inserting your questions, comments, and then we'll have both of our special guests, answer some of these questions as well with our time together. But Rana, I want to ask you to kind of build upon this conversation. A term that seems to be popping up as of late is techplomacy. So I don't believe we have, established exactly what we are thinking about, right? What's your personal definition of techplomacy, and where do you see it being important in the 21st century?
Well, I think that tech diplomacy or techplomacy, whether however you phrase it, I think has been with us for some time, in the sense that it's diplomatic activity that is focused on the technological domain. And so where that is palpably different right now is just the scale and importance and the amount of vectors that encompasses right now. So previously it was things like, ICANN and, dealing with the telecommunications infrastructure, lots of plumbing related issues, but also cybersecurity and many different aspects. And so if you think about jobs like mine, or jobs that had portions of what I was doing and what I'm up to here, is that previously we've got about 3 different models of tech diplomacy that are really taking place. One is the kind of purest form of tech diplomacy, which was maybe the Casper's model that Denmark rolled out, which was in Estonia and a few other countries that are trying to do these sorts of things, which is essentially just a diplomatic entity that is focused solely on technology companies in the tech ecosystem. The second is what I would call a cybersecurity plus sort of model, where we saw a lot of organizations and companies that, and countries that are, of course, needfully focused on cybersecurity, cyber protection, all of the kind of modalities and regimes that need to go into that, because it's not, this is not strict military security. There's offense, defense, and often offense and defense being run at the same time. There's, lots of intercomplexity, but there's also existing infrastructure that comes from the military. It comes from, various, our diplomatic structures that already exist out there. And so you have that capacity porting into more of the commercial side as well. Okay. And so that's kind of, the cyber security sort of a heavy tech diplomacy that we're seeing. And then what I would say is that, the kind of role that I play here probably is like the hybrid model of tech diplomacy, which is taking people with geographic responsibility. So I still have geographic responsibility. I'm the Consul General in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and Hawaii, and so and also I have commercial responsibility in the sense that working with the ecosystem, helping to sort of promote the Canadian ecosystem and what's taking place there. And so have all of these different types of relationships that are in addition to the looking at the offensive and defensive requirements that we need to address tech regulation and the tech companies themselves. And so, and when you're dealing with as fast moving as a complex an ecosystem as tech, our view at least, and this is the view thus far. We're all being somewhat experimental about doing things, but this is a point of advantage right now, just because so many different things are going on, and as Alexis was mentioning, obviously AI, of course, will become the next and already is in many ways. The next platform that we're in the midst of spending our time on.
This is where I'd love to bring up some questions for you, Alexis and Rana. I see a few that just popped in here. One from Tara that we'll get to. What do we think about the role of private companies and multilateral processes to define cyber norms, build capacity, and assist with implementation? So, Alexis, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think that what this is, I referred to just a moment ago about the fact that Microsoft hired away Kasper Kling, the former Danish tech ambassador, to be their ambassador to the EU. They also at the same time hired an ambassador to the United Nations. And I think that it would make a lot of sense for the other major tech companies to do similar kinds of things for two reasons. One, first of all, actually, they already had relationships with multilateral institutions. For the UN, for instance, there's Global Compact, which is sort of how businesses generally interact with the United Nations. So they didn't really need to find a road into the United Nations. They already had one. What they wanted was a diplomatic road into the United Nations, which was new. So I think that we're going to start seeing more and more of these kinds of roles. People in the tech sector, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, etc., creating diplomatic roles to engage with multilateral institutions, to influence things like the Paris Accords that came out a few years ago, that originated from the Digital Geneva Convention, which was promoted by Microsoft. It was one of the first times we've seen a kind of quasi-diplomatic treaty entered into by not countries, but companies. So I think we're going to see more of these kinds of things.
And Alexis, is there a clear separation between diplomacy and lobbyists? Because we know a lot of the big tech companies have been hiring a lot of lobbyists for a lot of these rules that are cropping up.
I think it's an important distinction to make, actually, in that the reason that these tech companies are engaged in diplomatic efforts are different than the reason that they're hiring lobbyists. So they're hiring lobbyists to influence legislation and regulation that will protect their business interests. The diplomacy arms of these kinds of firms are looking, I think, at broader principles. So, for instance, again, Microsoft entered into a treaty with I believe it was Rome or Vatican City on AI ethics. So these are the kinds
with
of things.
IBM. Yep.
Yes, exactly. And so when you look at the diplomatic relationships between tech companies and nation states, I think they're more focused on ethical principles or broader principles, not so much on specific strategies that will help benefit their companies.
Okay. I also think that, just to jump in on this one, I think that we've had this in the past, in the sense that we've always had standards bodies. We've always had a long conversation on issues that were actually percolating below the surface that people didn't really pay attention to. Things, internet standards, for instance, or telco standards. Like, those have always had commercial representation at what was a quasi-public forum, and were they pure multinational forums that were seated by national governments? Not always, but occasionally. And so there's always been a tension between these formats. The UN particularly, is very protective of the sovereignty rights of the states themselves, right? And so even UN bodies that are at those tables, don't, they have to fight for the same level of table access as the states themselves, and that's just built into the coda of the UN system. But now we're in a moment where the tech companies actually have they've got disproportionate power. Like, in many ways, one of the distinctive elements is not just the size and scale of these companies, but clearly their data power, their market making power, many of the standards making powers that they have, and which they are actually already doing. And this has been going on for a long time. Now what's happening, I think, is that there is this dance between multilateral organizations that are taking place, and nation states, and also third-party entities, be they the tech platforms themselves, which have an enormous amount of both expertise, ammunition, and standing naturally, but also third-party organizations. So I think a lot of the great thinking that's taking place, for instance, that we see, not just the UN high-level panel came out, the OECD sort of rulings came out. This is all building on many of the sort of the build-up post GDPR in Europe, but also we're seeing organizations that are popping up that are not governments, nor are they tech companies, that are having an enormous impact on the space. And I think this is where it gets exciting, because I think that nation states themselves have to rethink, who is at the table for these conversations. And, we saw, Canada out of the last G7, we had the presidency and then gave it to France, was GPAI came out of that. And that, may become one of those bodies that becomes, a de facto standards or protocol setting body. But who knows? I mean, I think that Alexis's point around the Digital Bill of Rights charters, where tech companies have been focused right now, is, I think, that the first port of call for them. And I think that as they get drawn more deeply into the operational layer of what we need to get done, that will, eventually come as well.
Well, that's the question I'd love to bring up, since you mentioned, Rana, some of these groups that are cropping up. We did have two questions. Here's one of them. Are there actually any particular multi-stakeholder groups or initiatives that you think are doing a good job in this space? So, Alexis or Rana, are there any ones specifically that you would kind of point people towards that you think are kind of the wave of where this is headed? Is it so new that you think that it's currently being formed?
We've almost got a surfeit of bodies out there. Like, we've got so many that are of competing interests, but there are some very good ones. I mean, I think that the UN high-level panel, the work that's coming out of that, will be very interesting. Things like GPAI will be very potentially very fruitful as well. And I also think that we haven't seen the end of the creation of new bodies that are sort of out there that potentially have implementation and legislative or quasi-legislative teeth that have sanctions associated with them, because I think those will be the ones that inevitably start to gain some power. But what I'd say as well is that the thing that people should focus on in our communities are, I think, where a lot of the great thinking is a lot of the centers of activity, like a lot of the think tank world, a lot of the sort of non-governmental organizations that have been, applying these boards for the better part of 30 years. And I think that those are a lot of good activity. And I think, even in place, in Canada right now, where, we historically have played a role as, a good actor and institution builder, for the better part of 100 years. We are building things like we've got, the Citizens Lab at the University of Toronto, at the Monk School. We've got the Max Bell Center that is just, a phenomenal new institution that I think is going to be very impactful. We have CG, and then you have the Oxford Internet Institute, and you've got all the work that's being done at NYU. So much good stuff, Columbia, that are out there, and Stanford out here. And so I think that you're really getting to this kind of critical mass of non-state actors who are actually becoming quasi-legislative or quasi decision-making entities as well, or at least will point to the direction of how we will start to create some of those.
I also like to mention, since our last live stream, we had Sophia Noble, who wrote Algorithms of Oppression. Her organization, alongside Sarah T. Roberts, they recently received $2.9 million from a Australian organization that is getting behind studying really this intersection of big tech power and diplomacy. Alexis, for you, I'm seeing a few questions. I'll bring up one that we have here. What do we think that these shifts will impact, or how do you think that these shifts will impact citizen views regarding the role and responsibility of governments? Right. So you mentioned earlier how Facebook and other big tech companies are getting into areas that used to be the domain of government. So are we going to start looking to Facebook as our government? Are we going to be looking at these tech companies with that type of role in mind?
So I think that our relationship with government is currently undergoing a shift. And one of the things that we're seeing, particularly in the United States the last few years, is a great loss of faith in institutions of government to deliver it at the federal level. So we're seeing cities step up in ways that have not traditionally been the case. And I mean, the pandemic response was, I think, a perfect example where cities and states were really kind of on their own to, for instance, procure PPE or other resources that they needed. So I think that one of the things that the relationship between citizens and their government in a perfect world is one in which citizens don't think about government very much. Like, I remember reading a piece about this a while ago where I can't remember the author, he described the relationship between citizens and their government as a boring one. And that's a good thing, that we want the government to provide for the roads and the bridges and make sure that the schools are all well, resourced and that we're protected. But we don't want it to be a source of friction. It's supposed to be something that's kind of in the background. And now I don't think that people have confidence that government can provide those basic resources. Part of this is because of the pandemic, but I think part of this extends the years before that because of the leadership crisis that we're having right now. So I think that people are not necessarily wanting to look at tech companies as providing for their safety and security, but I think they want someone who's going to get it done. And if they have a better chance of getting it done, they will.
So, Rana, this is where I'd love to bring you in, because this was actually a very hot issue recently in Canada, in Toronto specifically, with Sidewalk Labs, which is owned by Google, which was, I guess, building some major smart city. It's had a lot of twists and turns in the story, but that was, to Alexis's point, that's something where now you have a tech company that is supplying a lot of these basic kind of governmental needs. So do you have any insight or thoughts on tech companies and their involvement with smart cities, or maybe something specifically with that?
Yeah, I mean, I got to speak to the Sidewalk Labs example. Is just indicative. But what I would say is that I agree with Alexis's point that we're at a moment where clearly the power equation, the effectiveness equation, for at least a period was that tech companies were able to get things done at scale, and we're able to get things done at speed. A lot of the innovation that we were seeing in the world has been largely run out of tech, and so therefore, in the context of an erosion in public confidence in other institutions, tech was seen as some at least a potential pole to sort of rally around. But I think that what we've seen in the last 3 years, and particularly in the last 18 months, has been a reckoning of that cycle as well, where the tech companies themselves, obviously, they've got issues. They need to grow up and discover their own poles of sovereignty and responsibility, and are in the midst of doing that, building those capacities to do that. But also, I think governments, the shift around what we want governments to do has changed slightly. And this is maybe a slightly, I know I spend all my time in the United States and sheltering in place and all of that. But if you look around globally, though, like the pandemic and the accelerant of the pandemic has been a great example of this, in the sense that we have, we're in a moment now where governments are actually doing really effective things in parts of the world. And people are asking more of their government. They're seeing what happens when you don't have an effective government. What happens when, institutions that you thought were just, existed because they existed, all of a sudden don't exist, and what are the costs of that? And I think that we're maybe this is optimistic, but we are entering a moment where people are really thinking about that relationship between the citizen and government a lot differently. And so Sidewalk Labs is a really interesting example with that, in the sense that, here's an example of a project, and there's many reasons why that project hit the buffers in terms of, public confidence in Toronto. But I think that had it been any other place, and here's my view on Sidewalk Labs, anywhere else in the Western world, the similar set of issues that would have come up during that period, which is, originally you provide a project which says, oh, we're going to have these wonderful smart cities that are going to do all these great things, but wait, we'll tell you, what those are in a bit. But no one really was taking, not very seriously, but I mean, people weren't thinking down the stack to what does it mean to be a citizen, and where does the sovereignty ultimately lie? Who is this for? What is it for? What are the ultimate outcomes of that? And that's because we weren't at that place when Sidewalk. And this is not to discredit Sidewalk. I think that we just weren't at that place in the public conversation. But fast forward 18 months, all of a sudden the public is seized with these issues, and the companies and organizations that had plans for a prior era, they're just not as relevant. And so they would have to answer the questions about who is providing this service, who is it for, what who holds that data, what's how long is that data going to be held, what are the ultimate governance components to that data. And so one of the good outcomes, and I'll just say this about the Sidewalk experience in the city of Toronto, is that out of that came a concept around the data trust, which probably has, if we unpack that and develop that in various components, probably some way forward in terms of the way we start thinking about data as not just naturally sort of either residing, with the individual or with companies necessarily, but maybe there could be these third intermediaries that acted in public interest or the aggregate interest. So those are new concepts that actually came out of a process.
Well, Alexis, then to be highly topical, since you're with the city of New York has done a great job recently tamping down COVID. Obviously, there's always a lot of discussion around issues like data usage with contact tracing, something like that. So where do you see that role kind of expanding, or potentially not, with handling something like a pandemic? It relying on very sensitive data. That's something where there's an opportunity for collaboration between tech companies and governments. But then also the issue of trust seems to be very heightened in that situation.
No, I think that you really, that's the right perspective to take, is that trust is at the core of this. And what we've done in New York City with contact tracing has been very similar to how we provided services to citizens across the board. We've managed people's private information in many services, housing and for loans and paying taxes and things like that. And the difference is with contact tracing, there's the opportunity to bring in these tech companies and their products and services to help manage it. But it's not required for contact tracing. You could do contact tracing with pen and paper. Just ask people to write down their name and email address or their phone number. So I think that the public is not quite there in terms of being ready for a technological solution to contact tracing in the West, the way that we've seen perhaps in South Korea, which is a highly technological approach. I was actually recently in Vermont, and everywhere that we went, there was exactly pen and paper for writing down your name and information. And I asked around, and they said, yeah, nobody wants to put it into a computer, but they're very happy to put it on a piece of paper that can be thrown away. So there's a trust issue, I think, that we need to work on. It's not necessarily one between the citizens and the government necessarily, is so much between citizens and the tech companies.
So much for driverless cars. We're getting back to mail-in balloting and pen and paper. So for our final question, and then we'll just also learn where we can stay in touch with both of you. It's a couple questions from Joel, so I want to bring in one of them. Are you concerned with tech companies' unwillingness to collaborate with domestic intelligence, national security? And then to build upon what Joel is asking, specifically, what I was thinking about when he asked that question was Apple. There's always been a lot of issues with countries like the United States with Apple asking for quote unquote backdoor access to a lot of this information, especially when they're trying to track somebody down. That's been a hot topic with Tim Cook at Apple, of basically saying, what's his allegiance? Is it with Apple or is it as an American? So, Ron, do you have any thoughts on that? About there's always this tension, right? You've got the countries that are saying, "Hey, we need this. We need to track down terrorists. We need this for national security. We need to have this backdoor access." But then users of these technology, they're saying, "Well, wait a minute. I want to make sure that this technology is secure." So they might push back if a tech company like Apple does release a backdoor to a country.
Yeah, I think that we got to be very careful with that discussion, because I think that first of all, there is a lot that is already being done in the security space that may or may not be on the radar of individuals and conversations, and and I don't pretend to know all of the great details of what that is, but there has been historically a significant amount of cooperation when it came to things like terrorism, and it came to national security related concerns with the tech companies. And I think that the tech companies have actually developed, and this is where they're probably the best, quite frankly, in terms of their capacity to deal with governments, because they've been doing it for a considerable period of time. There are obvious safeguards within that. There are legal safeguards. There's a juridical framework which is fairly well established in this context. And the political context of this, I think, is potentially going to change with geopolitics. And right now we live in a world where liberal international order, trade rules, these sorts of governing principles have operated with, as the background radiation of our thinking on these topics. If, for instance, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if we were to move into a world where security was a much more binary discussion, or that the security environment was a much stronger integration of tech capabilities in the state, then I think companies would, their positions would change accordingly along those lines. But I think that the public is not quite there yet. Like, I think that there was a lot of support for Tim Cook when he took the positions that he did during that period, and so that other sort of hole in the midst of this is public sentiment, and the tech companies themselves are extremely sort of concerned about public sentiment, of course, and and governments themselves don't want to go up against public sentiment on these issues. So this is a kind of a tripartite dance that's going to continue for a while.
Sure. I see that we're nearing our time together. So again, I want to thank both of you. But before we head adieu, I want to thank everybody for tuning in with their great questions. But we also want to learn a little bit more, any final thoughts that both of you have, and then also where people can continue this conversation. 45 minutes is not enough on big tech, power, and diplomacy, especially how hot this is. So one, recommend reading The Information Trade, Alexis's book, learning more about this, staying in touch with us at alltechishuman.org, and also our partner, TheBridge, at thebridgework.com. But Alexis, any final thoughts, and then also where people can stay in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I just thank you so much for hosting this conversation. It's been so fun, and I've learned so much from both of you. And I just want to say that ultimately, I am optimistic. One of the things I think when you write about technology, it's very easy to go down a rabbit hole of doom and gloom. And I don't feel that way, actually. And I think the book reflects that. There's a shifting order. There are new norms. There are new relationships and dynamics. But that doesn't mean they're all bad. And doesn't mean it's all going to mean our ruin. I think that there's a lot that we can do if we organize ourselves into a voice that can speak up for citizens' rights. And so I just want to leave with that note. I feel hopeful about the future.
That is very hopeful, and we need that right around now. And then where can people stay in touch with you? Do you prefer Twitter, or is there somewhere ideal?
I'm on Twitter at @Wichowski, and I'm just also at awichowski@gmail.com.
Terrific. Alexis, thank you for joining us. So Rana, what about yourself? Any closing thoughts that you might have, and also where people can stay in touch with you?
Yeah, I like Alexis. I'm an optimist, not necessarily a tech optimist, but I'm an optimistic where society is going in this context, because I think that one of the most interesting sort of elements of this last couple of years that I really found was that in the naming of the mechanism of what is taking place, this idea of not just surveillance economics or attention economics, or the mechanisms that companies are actually using to work with us, is in just doing that, we've uncovered a lot about what we want from both organizations, what we want from our societies. And so this idea of pro-human technology is something which has gathered pace, and in the context of everything from COVID to all of the disruptions that that are out there right now, I think that we're in a moment where I think we can be optimistic about all of these new learnings that are taking place. And so just to reach me, I'm Rana Sarkar _ on Twitter.
Terrific. Well, Alexis and Rana, thank you both. And then I will say, since you mentioned pro-human, that's why we're all tech is human. So yes, definitely +1 to that. Thank you everybody for joining us today. We'll be back in a couple weeks with another live stream. You can drop a line at hello@alltechishuman.org. So Alexis and Rana, thank you both for joining us today to talk about big tech, power, and diplomacy.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.